Hi, I'm Liz Reichman, docent at the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio and a history grad student at UTSA. Thank you for joining me this morning, and thanks again to the San Antonio Public Library for hosting this year's event. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I appreciate you coming, and I hope you will feel free to ask me questions. The library knows how to reach me, and I'm sure they've come up with a plan to gather your questions and to forward them on to me. This is my mother-in-law, Xena Reichman. She was one of three sisters, the Kozłowska sisters, all from Białystok, Poland, who survived the Holocaust and were reunited in Israel after the war. Their stories are radically different. Xena was the youngest. Born in 1923, she was forced into the Białystok ghetto with her parents in 1941, when she was just 18 years old. In 1943, when the ghetto was destroyed and any surviving Jews were sent to camps, she was sent to Auschwitz. Her middle sister, 6 years older, Sonia, escaped to Israel, then Palestine, sometime in the mid-1930s. It's her older sister, Luba, that I'd like to focus on today. Luba survived the war in hiding. I'd like to talk about Jews like her, Jews who survived the Holocaust in hiding. I'll offer a few stories of Jews who survived in hiding, some of which will be brief anecdotes told in passing to illustrate some point, but others will be more fully fleshed out and will demonstrate different ways that Jews hid during the war. I'd also like to offer a few general observations about who these people were, these people that hid during the war. I never met Luba. She was 13 years older than Xena. I did meet her son, Dov, and I knew that the two of them were hidden during the war. I thought I knew what that meant. I imagined that they were concealed from sight, literally hidden in an attic or a basement or a cellar for the duration of the war. My mother-in-law passed away about 10 years ago. She never spoke about her wartime experiences. We knew she had been in a camp because she had a tattoo on her forearm. After her death, my husband and I decided to explore her background, to research it and see what we could find out. We wanted to write a book about the family to share with our family to memorialize her life and that of my father-in-law, Abraham. We contacted Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel. It's not just a museum, it's also a repository for documents about where Jews were during the war, what camps, what ghettos, how they were moved. And it's also has a collection of oral histories of Jews who survived the war and wanted to tell their experiences, and they have them collected. When we researched her story, we discovered that much of what we'd assumed was wrong. For example, we realized we really didn't know what it meant to be hidden. Were Luba and Dov concealed in a basement, in an attic? Pictured here is the most famous hidden Jew, Otto Frank. I'm sure you've heard of her, and we'll come back and talk about her story more in detail in a moment. When my husband and I heard hidden, we imagined that Luba and Dov were in an attic or a cellar like Otto Frank. But when we investigated the family history, we realized we really didn't know that. Were they hiding in plain sight? Maybe passing as Christians? We knew that Polish Christian neighbors helped hide them, but what did that mean? Did it mean that someone volunteered to let them sit in their cellar? Or did it mean that someone said that they were distant cousins who'd come to spend the war on the farm or in the town with them? We didn't know what it meant. A little more about Luba and her story. In 1939, she was married with a baby, Dov, the son I mentioned earlier. Remember what happened in 1939. On September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. Now, in Białystok, they came to Białystok, but they didn't stay. They didn't occupy Germany because before the war, Hitler and Stalin had divided Poland in two, and Hitler would get the western part of Poland and Stalin would get the eastern part of Poland. Białystok was in the eastern part of Poland. So shortly after that initial invasion, Soviet troops came in and Stalin took control of Białystok. Sometime after 1939 and before 1941, because you may recall what happened in 1941, that the Nazis invaded Poland again, this time on their way to Moscow as part of Operation Barbarossa, where they decided to conquer all of Poland and to move on and to conquer the Soviet Union. Sometime between 1939 and 1941, when the Nazis came in for the second time, Luba's husband fled to the east, fled to the Soviet Union, with the hopes of finding a job and a place to live, and with the intention of getting Luba and Dov out of Poland. He knew it was a dangerous situation, and he wanted to find somewhere safer for them, so he went to the east. But the family lost contact with the husband, and so Luba and Dov were forced to go into hiding. Now, you may be thinking that the obvious way for my husband and I to find out what Luba's story was to ask Dov. He was born in 1939. In 1944, when the Soviets liberated Białystok, he would have been 5 years old. In 1945, when the war ended, he would have been 6 years old. Children can remember when they were 5 and 6. And so surely Dov would have some memory of the time that he was in hiding that we could just ask him. Well, we did ask him, and he didn't remember anything. In fact, he not only doesn't remember the period when he and his mother were in hiding, but he also doesn't remember the period after the war, between 1945 and 1948, when they were searching for surviving family members and when they were living in displaced person camps. He doesn't remember anything about his childhood until 1948, when he and his mother and my mother-in-law, Xena, immigrated to Israel. It's as though he was reborn in 1948 when he arrived in Israel. So hiding can mean different things. It could mean concealed, or it can mean disguised. In either case, there are a few general conclusions we can draw about Jews who were in hiding. Scholars have studied Jews in hiding, and a paper written about them that studied nearly 400 Polish Jews in hiding offered some general conclusions. The paper was written by Hammad, a sociologist at the University of Connecticut. I'd say, remember that name, Hammad, because she's going to come up again later. The first general observations that we can make are about the experiences of men versus women in hiding. 60% of women were hiding in plain sight, passing as Christians, while only 40% of men did this. The main reason? Well, it's physiological. Circumcision. At that time in Europe, only Jewish men were circumcised. And so if Nazis or Polish collaborators wanted to find out if someone was Jewish or not, they just had to ask a man to drop his pants. In investigating the background of this study and of hidden Jews, I came across this anecdote. There was a Jewish man hiding in Poland who was stopped one day by a Polish man holding a gun and told to go into an alley. He was told to drop his pants and prove that he wasn't a Jew. Well, he was a Jew, so he couldn't prove he wasn't a Jew. Instead, he told the gunman, please, would he take some money? And the gunman eagerly accepted and took what money the man had in his pocket. As he walked away, the Jewish man turned to the gunman and said, what gave me away? Was it how I'm dressed? Is it how I talk? Have you been following me? And the extortionist laughed and said, I had no idea you were a Jew. I've been standing here and pulling random men over and asking them to drop their pants. Sometimes I get lucky. So if the physiological reason is the primary reason why women were able to hide in plain sight and men couldn't, there were also other reasons, cultural and sociological reasons why women were better able to hide in plain sight. One is that women were considered to be less important in society, more easily overlooked. They were second-class citizens. That was true in Polish society, but even more true in Nazi society. Men were the ones who were involved in politics and the ones who fought wars. Women, they were supposed to stay at home, to raise children, to cook, to clean house. They weren't important. So Nazi soldiers and Polish collaborators were less concerned with what women were doing. A woman who was out in the daytime was not likely to be stopped and be forced to show papers and prove who she was. Of course, another reason is that women could more easily change their appearances. They could wear wigs or dye their hair, wear completely different clothes, or wear makeup to change how they looked. Of course, men could do this too. A man could wear a wig, a man could dye his hair, a man could grow a beard or shave a beard and also disguise himself in that way. But it was less common, less acceptable. For a woman to wear makeup or wear a wig wasn't a big deal. Women did that even when it wasn't wartime. Men seldom did. So it was more uncomfortable for them to try to do that. Women could also more easily find work. In fact, of Jews who were passing, 40% of women had a job, while only 20% of men did. Now, the reason for this is pretty interesting too, and again, it has to do with cultural assumptions. A man had to have a job. A man out in the daytime, what was he doing? A man should be working in a factory. A man should be fighting on the front. A man should be working on a farm. He shouldn't be out wandering around. He should be doing something. A woman, as I said before, was overlooked, that she might be a mother or have some excuse why she wasn't at work. She might have children to take care of at home. But also, women could have a wider variety of jobs. They could work in defense plants and they could work on farms like men could, but they could also be domestic servants. A woman could wash clothing. A woman could watch someone else's children, or a woman could be a housekeeper. These were jobs that certainly men could do, but men didn't do in those days. A man wouldn't be a washer. He wouldn't wash clothes. He wouldn't watch children. He wouldn't keep house. So that whole category of jobs was not open to him. And these, of course, were jobs for which you didn't need papers. To go into a defense factory, you might have to prove who you were. But to be a washerwoman, no papers required. A final fascinating reason I'll offer that it was easier for women to pass is that women were more likely to have a secular education. Jews value education, and Jewish boys were sent to get a religious education, to go to cheder, to study Torah and Talmud. Education was also valued for girls, but they didn't get a religious education. Instead, they went to the neighborhood public school with the Polish kids in the neighborhood. And because of that, they learned to speak Polish in addition to perhaps speaking Yiddish at home, and might also learn to speak other languages that were taught in the school. They might learn to speak German and Russian, for example, if they lived in Bialystok. They also learned the slang of the day. They knew what movies the girls their age were watching, and they knew what music they were listening to. So they could act like they were Polish Christian girls when they were out in the world. It was easier for them because they'd been around Polish Christian girls. A second observation we can make about Jews in hiding is that they were more likely to be wealthy. Imagine the resources that you would have to be in hiding. There might be bribes to be paid in order to keep neighbors quiet. If you weren't, for example, the extortionist in the alley who pulled the man over and asked him to drop his pants and prove he wasn't a Jew. He was lucky he had enough money on him to persuade the man to leave him alone. Bribes might have to be paid in a more sophisticated plan, as we'll see later. But think too, if you had good friends, maybe neighbors who cared about you and were eager to help hide you, you would be grateful, but you would also want to help them pay for your food, help them pay for your clothing, for any sort of medicine. It was wartime and food was scarce and it was expensive. So you would hope to pay for your upkeep or your children's upkeep. So it was more helpful to be wealthy. A third general observation is that 95% of the Jews in hiding had some kind of help. It could be elaborate help, as we'll see when we talk about Anne Frank and some other examples of Jews in hiding, or it could be something more spontaneous. Another anecdote I came across in the course of researching for this lecture was of a young woman who found a job as a secretary in a defense factory. She was successfully passing as a Christian until one day A German officer came into the office, and it was a boy she'd gone to college with. Their eyes locked, and she knew that he recognized her. And she knew that he knew that she was a Jew. But after that initial jolt of recognition, his eyes got fuzzy and he looked through her. He'd made the decision not to turn her in, that he was going to pretend like he didn't know her. And so she was safe. A smaller and more spontaneous example of help, but there were times when that was the kind of help that Jews received. Suspicious neighbors deciding not to act on their suspicions. Now, I have to remind you that this was unusual. There weren't a lot of people who hid Jews, and there weren't a lot of people who had the courage not to turn in suspicious neighbors. Some people might do so in order to receive a reward. Some people might turn them in because they were afraid for their own well-being. That certainly, it was the law that you were supposed to turn in Jews, and it was against the law to try to hide Jews. That a family that had the courage to hide another Jewish family, well, they were putting themselves and their own family at risk. When we tell these stories of successfully hiding Jews and of righteous Gentiles who helped them, I think sometimes it makes it seem like it was common, but in fact, it was the exception. A fourth general observation we can make is that Jews in hiding found themselves in a dynamic situation. In some of the stories we hear, some of the well-known stories, it seems that a good hiding place is found and someone is able to stay in that hiding place or to stay with that secret identity for the whole war. But in fact, situations were more likely to be dynamic. For example, the man who was stopped in the alley and extorted, he changed his apartment immediately after that. Even though the extortionist told him that he wasn't suspicious, the Jewish man didn't believe him, and so he moved on to a new apartment. Another example I can give is that often families felt safer if they split up. I came across this story in researching this lecture. There was a family that had 2 young children in Poland. To keep the children safe, the parents sent them to stay in an orphanage, to be with nuns, and told the nuns that they were to say that the children were orphans and they didn't know what had happened, and to try to keep them until the war was over. And they paid the nuns some money for the children's upkeep. I wouldn't call it a bribe. I would call it more just for their sustenance. The couple themselves, they were fortunate enough to find a hiding place behind a church organ. Now, it was just a small storage space. They couldn't stand up in it. And in fact, they had to spend the time lying down. I think of it as being lying inside the cover of a grand piano. They had to be still and quiet about 20 hours a day, whenever anyone might be in the church. And only at night, when it was completely quiet, could they come out and stretch their legs and move around. In order to stay quiet and still, the couple took sleeping pills because it was difficult to lie motionless 20 hours a day. They tried to sleep on their own, but they would hear sounds and they would hear sounds get closer and it made them anxious. And so they took sleeping pills in order to make themselves be still. Now, they were able to stay in that hiding place for the duration of the war, but I offer that as a situation, as an example of dynamism, because the family knew it had to split up. They knew they couldn't stay together. There'll be more examples of how situations were dynamic to come. But the final conclusion, and these are all from the study by Hammad, was the emotional toll that hiding took. There was constant fear, isolation, loneliness, and boredom. Imagine the couple hiding in the storage space, having to be still for 20 hours a day. Imagine the man who was passing as Christian, constantly being afraid that someone would ask him to drop his pants, or that he would be in a public bath, or that somehow his true identity would be revealed. Another example of the emotional toll that this study found was that the hidden felt that they were lucky, despite the constant stress. They felt they were lucky because they had a chance for survival. They knew what was happening. They knew that Jews were forced into ghettos and were being slowly starved to death. And they knew that Jews were being taken to camps where they were being murdered. They felt that by being in hiding, they at least had a chance at survival. And so they felt they were the lucky ones. Interestingly enough, the study showed that the Jews in ghettos and camps felt the opposite. They thought that they were the lucky ones because they weren't alone. Jews in camps were with their families, they were with their friends, and best of all, they got to use their own names, their own identities, and live as Jews. They didn't have to pretend to be someone else and denied their own identity. They felt they were the lucky ones. But back to Anne Frank. This is an example of hiding as concealed. If we were meeting live and we're all together in one room, and if this were not a recording, I would ask you to raise your hand at this point and tell me if you're familiar with this story, if you've read the Diary of Anne Frank. And I'm sure many hands would go up. Maybe everyone in the room would raise his hand. And then I would ask how many people have been to see Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. And I think, again, we'd get a few hands raised in the room. I haven't been there, so I can't speak from firsthand experience about it. But this is a well-known story. In her story, we can see some of the observations that I just made, some of these general experiences of Jews in hiding. For example, the Frank family was wealthy. Otto Frank had been a wealthy businessman when the family lived in Germany. And remember, he sold his business and was able to get his family into Amsterdam, which he thought was safer, not knowing that the Nazis were going to invade the Netherlands as well. So he had the resources to take his family out. He also had the resources to set up this elaborate hiding place. And pictured here, we see not only Anne, but we also see the door to the hidden annex, the bookshelf on the left-hand side of the screen, and we see schematics of Otto Frank's business, that he had offices, he had, to some extent, factories, and he had this warehouse, this annex off to the far right-hand side. He had the resources to convert this annex into a place for people to live, to convert it into 3 small apartments, and even to install indoor plumbing. As we think of how Jews more typically lived in hiding, I think it's really exceptional that he was able to create this hiding place for them. He was able to house 3 different households in this hiding place. His own family, him and his wife and his 2 daughters, Margot and Anne, but also to invite in another family, the Nels family, who you remember, and the dentist, Fritz Pfeffer, a divorced man who you recall ended up sharing space with Anne, a space that Anne thought she was going to have to herself. He also had the resources to activate his employees. There were 4 groups of helpers here. I say 4 groups because sometimes the groups were a couple. For example, the Geese family, that couple, both helped, but I'll call them 4 groups because there were 4 distinct groups who were employees of Otto Frank. Now, he didn't pay them bribes to hide the family. They were very loyal to him, and they were remarkably compassionate, courageous people to say yes, that they would hide him. But he was able to provide them the resources to pay for the food, to pay for the books and the newspapers, to bring into the family in hiding. He did have the resources to do that. And of course, he had the contacts to be able to know people, to have people who would be loyal to him and who would say, yes, I will help hide your family. Certainly, they were taking enormous risks. And you know the end of the story, that they were betrayed and that the Nazis came to the annex and they took all the Jews and sent them to camps. And only Otto Frank survived. You may also remember, I don't know that it's at the end of the book, but perhaps if you've read a little more, that 2 of the rescuers were arrested. One of them was a man who did not share his secret with his spouse, that he kept it all inside. He felt like that if he were to tell her, even though he might feel better because he was able to share the stress, she would be liable to be arrested because she would also know about sheltering these Jews. So he never told her. So 2 of the rescuers were also arrested. So they did suffer for their good deed. They did survive the war, however, and the rescuers were recognized by the state of Israel as being righteous Gentiles, that their courage and the risks they took was recognized. Now, before we leave Anne Frank, I'll go back to the idea that her example is atypical. Normally, when Jews were hidden, they weren't hidden in elaborate annexes with indoor plumbing. More normally, they had to worry about how they would eat, how they would drink, how they would go to the bathroom, how they would bathe, how they would be quiet, how would they stay still. How would they occupy their minds during this time? I gave you the example of the couple that hid in the storage space behind the organ, that would be a more typical example of Jews in hiding in the sense of being concealed. Another example we learned of when we went to Poland to try to follow the paths that my mother and father-in-law took during the war, we heard of this story when we visited the Warsaw Ghetto from our guide. He said that a young boy had been hidden in the sewer just outside the ghetto right before the war started. And his parents had paid neighbors who were good friends to come to the sewer grate and to feed him every day. Now, this boy was able to successfully hide in the sewer for the entire war. And those neighbors that they'd given money to pay to keep this boy alive did come every day and feed him. But certainly, it was a much humbler situation than the annex. I'd like to move to an example of passing, of hiding in plain sight. And the story I'd like to tell is that of Nechama, the woman who wrote the paper about hidden Jews in Poland. Nechama was herself a hidden Jew. Born in 1931 in Lublin, Poland, she became a sociologist and worked at the University of Connecticut. She's a professor emerita today, and she's written extensively about the Holocaust. The paper I mentioned, but she's also the author of a sociological study of Jews who hid in the forest and acted as partisans and helped Soviet and Polish partisans fight against the Germans. She wrote a study of the Bielski brothers, who you may remember as having their story told in the movie Defiance, starring Daniel Craig. That movie started as a sociological study written by Nechama. She's also written about her own life and has published a memoir called Dry Tears, The Story of a Lost Childhood, about her time in hiding. Anything she's written is fascinating to read. She's a good writer. She is an academic writer, and maybe because I'm a grad student, I enjoy that kind of writing, but it is pretty easy to read, even if you're not a grad student in history. The other interesting thing about her writing, in my opinion, is that it's so compartmentalized. Even her memoir reads as though the events described happened to someone else. They're fascinating events, but she writes about them like a sociologist. Okay, so what was her story? As you can see from these pictures, she was a light-haired and light-eyed child. So it was easy for her to pass because she didn't look stereotypically Jewish. She was also from a wealthy family. Her father owned a factory in Lublin. And they had numerous contacts, and her father had loyal employees, and they had good neighbors who agreed to help the family. The father came up with an elaborate plan to put his family into hiding in 1941, when the Nazis were forcing Jews in Lublin into ghettos too. His plan was that the family would split up. The two children would go stay with a Polish family a little further outside of town, and they would claim to be cousins from a rural area that had come to spend the war with that family. And he paid the family to take care of his daughters. He and his wife disappeared into another kind of hiding place that I don't recall Nechama details, but the family had to split up. They found people to take care of their apartment and gave them a cover story to say that the Tech family had escaped to another country, and so was no longer in Lublin. And this father had loyal employees like Otto Frank, and one of them agreed to keep the factory running during the war as best he could. In some ways, their story is more typical in that they kept moving from place to place. The first family that agreed to hide Nechama became afraid. They thought their neighbors were suspicious, and they thought they would be raided and arrested. So Nechama was moved to a second family. That family was paid money, and they were given some other sort of cover story about who Nechama and her sister were. But that family too became nervous and said, "We don't think we can do it. We think we're going to be arrested. We can't keep your daughters." And so remarkably, in the end, Nechama ended up on a farm with her parents. I say remarkable because it's unusual that a family was reunited like that and ended up hiding in the same place. It's also remarkable to read this story and see the fluidity of family roles. At the beginning of the war, the father is the man in charge, that he's organized, he's intelligent, he comes up with a plan to save his family and try to save his resources, his apartment and his factory as best he can. By the time they're on the farm, things have changed. The father is the person who is most likely to be hiding in the sense of concealed, that when neighbors come over or when Nazi soldiers come, and they do come, sometimes they're looking for resources to steal from the farm, sometimes they're looking for Jews, he has to hide in the cellar and has to completely secrete himself because otherwise everyone is at risk. In the meantime, Nechama, who's just a child, and her mother, who's described at the beginning of the memoir as being a nervous woman who spent a lot of her time crying at the beginning of the war, they become the primary breadwinners for the family. It turns out the mother's a good cook, and she has enough flour and enough yeast and enough eggs to bake. And so she starts to get up early every morning and bake rolls that she then gives to Nechama, who's 12 years old, perhaps, that she takes into town and tries to sell. So Nechama, who's just a child, is the one who's trying to sell these rolls, to bargain for a good price, and then to get home safely with the money that she's earned in order to give that money to the family, to give to the family that's sheltering them. You know, it's a fascinating role reversal and what people have to do during wartime. Nechama too complains to some extent. I admit that she's very detached from some of her experiences, that it was bewildering to her to have to switch identities, that when she went into town, she had to pretend to be a Polish Christian girl. She had to act like one. She had to speak like one, use a false name. If there were any taunts or chants about Jews, she had to pretend like it just bounced off her, that it didn't apply to her. And then when she came home, she could be herself again and use her real name and be her real self. The family did survive the war, all of them, remarkably. And they returned to their home in Lublin. When they went to the factory, they discovered that it had been nationalized by the Soviets, who came into Lublin and liberated it from the Nazis. So the family lost that asset. Then they went to their apartment and weren't sure that they wanted to stay, but hoped to reclaim some of their belongings that they'd left behind. They knocked on the door and looked in. And in a poignant moment, Nechama describes that the people who were staying in the apartment denied that any of their things had survived, said they'd all been taken, and that this wasn't their apartment, and they didn't know what they were talking about. They said all that when Nechama could look in the doorway and clearly see her mother's silverware laid out on the dining room table, that she knew they were lying. Certainly it wasn't worth fighting about, they decided. They were alive, and that's what they should remember. And so the family moved on. The final story I'd like to share with you is another story of hiding and passing, but not passing to survive, as most of these stories are, that mostly Jews were hidden, either concealed or passing in order to survive. This is a story of survival, but it's also a story of resistance. I think that's one reason why this is one of my favorite stories. It's the story of Bronka Klebanski. I also like this story because her life parallels my mother-in-law's life in a lot of ways. For example, they were both born in 1923 in the Białystok area. They both attended public school and learned to speak Polish, considered themselves to be Polish citizens, at least for a while, and learned to speak languages. They were both adept with learning languages and could speak them well. Bronka, unlike my mother-in-law, was not from a well-off family. She was from a family that was fighting to be middle class. And in fact, they thought they'd achieved it in 1935 when her father went from being a peddler to being a kiosk owner, that he'd finally established a kiosk in the city. And he felt like now they had a chance of being middle class. The kiosk was destroyed by anti-Semitic thugs, busting the family back down into poverty. At that moment, Bronka resolved that she would get out of Poland, that she stopped identifying as a Polish girl and started identifying as a Jewish girl. To advance that dream, she joined a youth movement called Dror. And I think I have to pause here and digress a bit and explain that in 2021, when you think of youth groups, I think we think of soccer clubs and maybe groups like the Boy Scouts that do good deeds. But in this period of time in the 1930s, youth groups were often political. There were socialist youth groups, communist youth groups, and Zionist youth groups who had the goal of getting Jews out of Poland, out of Eastern Europe, and into Palestine. That was the kind of youth group that Branca joined. And what's interesting is these youth groups became some of the primary organizers in the ghettos and in the camps. They had a pool of young people who had a common ideology, who would put out newsletters, hold plays, and form resistance groups against the Nazis. So Branca joined Dror as soon as she was old enough. The leader of her group of Dror was a young man named Mordechai Tenenbaum, who was about 6 years older than her, who she immediately developed a crush on. He was a dashing, charismatic figure. Well, in 1941, Branca and her family were forced into the Bialystok ghetto, another parallel with my mother-in-law's life. Her looks, her language abilities, and her chutzpah led her to play a special role when she was in the ghetto. The ghetto seems to have had a relatively porous border, and people could slip in and out. And Branca learned to do that because of her language abilities, because of her strawberry blonde hair and light color eyes. She was someone who could slip in and out of the ghetto and could take out intelligence and take out items to trade and bring in food and sometimes even weapons. Another story about Branca that demonstrates her personality. She was put in charge of a work group, a group of young women that was taken out of the ghetto in the day and sent to work on a farm. They were sent to work outside and did hard work. Well, one morning it was sleeting, and Branca decided she didn't want to work. So she told the other girls in the group not to get up, to sleep in and to stay warm, and she would go talk to the Nazi officer that came to get them. So she showed up, and she informed him with great confidence that when it was sleeting and below freezing, the girls didn't have to work outside. Well, she said it with such confidence that he believed her. Of course, there was no rule like that, but it shows the kind of personality she had and the confidence that she was able to project. Primarily, however, she worked as a courier and slipped in and out of the ghetto. And finally, in 1943, she was told that she needed to stay outside. She had a good set of forged papers. She had a good fake identity, and they wanted her to stay outside and preserve that. They wanted her outside too, because Mordechai Tenenbaum and the other members of Dror were planning an uprising. The ghetto was being liquidated, and the Jews were being sent to camps. And he decided that they needed to make one last stand against the Nazis. They knew it was suicide. They knew they couldn't win against the entire army, but they felt they had to try. And Branca, who by now was his lover, was too valuable to be inside the ghetto when that happened, that the movement couldn't afford to lose her in this uprising. So he told her she had to stay outside. The uprising took place, and as they suspected, everyone was murdered. Everyone except Branca, who was outside. She describes herself as being heartbroken. She'd lost her family, who had been deported to camps, and now she'd lost her friends and her lover, who'd been killed in the uprising. What was she going to do? She had to keep fighting, not just to survive, but now she had to channel her anger in a new way. So she continued to be a spy. She continued to use that set of forged papers, now to smuggle intelligence and to smuggle weapons to the partisans who were helping the Soviet Union fight against the Nazis. For example, she obtained a drawing of an airfield outside of Bialystok and was able to get that detailed drawing of the airfield to the Soviets so that they were able to bomb it and the Nazis couldn't land any airplanes there. She was asked how it felt to have this false identity. And Branca said that it was better inside the ghetto. I think some of us would be surprised to hear that we would think it would be a relief not to be in the ghetto, not to be starved, not to be subject to typhus or the disease that was spreading there. That if we had a way not to be there, we would feel good. We would be relieved. We would think we had a chance of survival. But Branka says that's not how she felt. That when she was inside the ghetto, she was comfortable. She was with her family. She was with her friends. She was with her lover. And most of all, she could be herself. She could be Branka Klubansky, a Jewish girl from Bialystok. Outside, she said it was much scarier, that she was afraid of being discovered, and she had to constantly be acting, being someone else. Branka survived the war, and she too immigrated to Israel. Another parallel with my mother-in-law. Her first choice occupation, you wouldn't be surprised to know that she wanted to be an actress. Well, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of demand for girls who spoke poor Hebrew with a heavy Polish accent, and so she didn't get a job as an actress. She did, however, get a job as an archivist in Yad Vashem and began to tell the stories of the people who had perished. The first story that she told was the story of Mordechai Tenenbaum and the Dror youth group that he led in the uprising. And that's what we're doing today. We're telling stories. That's our role, to tell the stories and to remember what happened. We are remembering too. I'd like to let Anne Frank have the last word. Be the one to set a good example. Then it won't be long before others follow. How lovely that we can start now, start slowly changing the world. Thank you for joining.